Great to be with all of you here today. My name's James Collier. Oh, hang on. Just flip this around.
You got it. Good.
Perfect. And I'm a principal threat intelligence advisor in Europe, so I spend my time kind of briefing organizations in the region, helping them understand the threats that we face and how to build out threat intelligence capabilities. I'm joined by my colleague John, who I'll ask to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, John Doyle. I'm also a principal consultant here at Mandiant. Got about 15 years in the field, and I teach the CTI course, amongst other things.
Great. Thanks, John. And we're going to be talking today about a threat intelligence use case that probably isn't discussed anywhere near as much as it could be. And that is cyber risk and how we can kind of integrate the two disciplines. Because if we look back, really they've actually emerged as very separate disciplines. We've got kind of a threat intelligence team, you've got a cyber risk team. They're often not necessarily talking to one another or collaborating in the ways that they could be. But at the same time, there's huge benefits to doing that for the organization. So if we can actually build that collaboration between those two functions, we're going to have a much more synchronized defense organization. We're going to be able to use threat intelligence in far more strategic ways. So we want to explore how we do that in this talk, but also be really honest about some of the challenges, right? We want to make sure that this content is speaking to the kind of lived experience of most security functions that are maybe resource constrained, feeling a little bit tired right now, acknowledging the politics and all the challenges that come in this space. But I think it's a really important time to be addressing this because on the one hand, we've got these very clear silos in our organization when we're not collaborating between these two spaces. There's a lack of connection, but at the same time, we're often complaining that we are resource constrained. We're complaining or we're observing that it's really difficult to hire people with the right skills within cybersecurity. So we've got, at the same time as all these challenges around personnel, we've got probably what is duplication of efforts. We've got very clear inefficiencies. We've got these two teams that are often addressing the same sort of issues, but not collaborating. And it just seems like a mad way to operate in a way, given the reality of most organizations. And then there are challenges for each of these disciplines separately. So if we kind of look at the reaction of executives trying to understand threat intelligence, it's often really inaccessible, right? If you had an executive come to a threat intelligence conference, they'd be hearing about some kind of new bespoke technique used by an UNC group that they've not heard of. They'd be hearing about some kind of scattered spider thing that they don't really understand. They'll be asking some pretty piercing questions a lot of the time of how this is relevant to me. How can they kind of navigate through the estimative language, all of the different analytical techniques that kind of create these threat intelligence reports. So there's a challenge for threat intelligence in building influence with executives. I think a lot of the organizations we speak to, they want to influence executives, they want to kind of break into strategic intelligence, but they're maybe initially focused on the security operations center. And then on the other side, we've got challenges within cyber risk. So when we talk about cyber risk, the assessments will often have really in-depth understanding of the internal tech stack, of the business priorities, but when it comes to actually threat metrics, they might just say kind of cyber criminal. And of course, as you see in the image, we know that cyber criminals always use MacBooks. But there's a challenge there in that that's the part of a cyber risk assessment that is really typically quite poor, where the cyber threat metrics aren't about the most recent cyber criminal groups active in my region and my sector. It's just cyber criminal, or just hacktivists, without any kind of sense of what these terms mean, how the threat is changing in those environments. So that means that we have very lopsided threat assessments. Or risk assessments rather, that are very weak and very kind of often kind of poor when it comes to the threat metrics. So clear opportunities for, given the challenges that both of these parts of the organization face, for them to help each other. So why isn't this happening? And we've got to be honest, we've got to accept that there are some very real challenges and some blockers in integrating cyber risk and threat intelligence. Part of that comes down to misperception. We often, or cyber risk might often perceive threat intelligence as a very operational space, a very kind of tactical space, much more to do with incident response and security operations centers than something highly strategic. Whereas, maybe within threat intelligence, we also dismiss risk. We might think these people don't really get it. They're not really connected to the front lines in the way that we are. We also use different lexicons as these disciplines have emerged. We have different kind of ways of looking at things. We have different frameworks that I know John's going to talk about a little bit later. A lot of the CTI processes and workflows are very different to the way that we kind of might look at things within cyber risk. There's then cultural differences. I think for threat intelligence, obviously, it's very threat-led. That knowledge of the threat landscape almost becomes the kind of hammer for many different nails. Cyber risk has a different approach, perhaps a little bit more internal focused at times. And then ultimately, as these disciplines have emerged, they've become dedicated career paths. There's actually much more kind of specialist knowledge for each of these spaces. And that effectively increases the barriers to entry for collaborating, because you need to kind of protect, or there's a perception that you need to have all these skills in two disciplines rather than one. So I want to now talk about, well, why does a threat intelligence team stand to benefit? You know, we might accept that the organization as a whole stands to benefit, but what's in it for me if I'm being really selfish? Well, first of all, cyber risk and kind of risk assessment is a great vehicle to build influence with executive audiences. A lot of executives aren't necessarily speaking the language of threat intelligence. They're speaking they're speaking about cybersecurity in the context of broader risk management discussions. So if we can kind of get involved in that kind of process, if we can contribute to that process, all of a sudden we're going to find that threat intelligence has a lot of influence with not necessarily just a CISO, but maybe a C-suite, maybe even kind of boards more broadly. This is one of the best ways to actually communicate threats in a way that's going to be actioned by these sorts of executive demographics. Second, I think there's an opportunity here to contribute to really strategic initiatives. I saw later in the program, we're going to be talking about how threat intelligence can play a role in mergers and acquisitions. We might kind of also think about areas like market entry. You know, if I'm a bank or a manufacturing company and I want to enter the Chinese market or the Vietnamese market, for instance, I want to offshore some of my kind of capability. The company is, of course, going to do a big kind of risk management about the political risk, the security risk, etc. And if threat intelligence can be a big part of those strategic initiatives, again, it's going to be able to really establish its value. It's going to be kind of highlight the kind of return on investment that function is providing. I think it was a point that John actually made yesterday, is that for threat intelligence, we're often a little bit weaker when it comes to understanding our internal environment. We can talk about the threat landscape. How does it actually relate to our own environment? Chances are that the cyber risk team have already done a lot of that work for us. For those that know me, John will know this about me, I'm a copy and paste merchant. So when there's an opportunity to kind of repurpose work, I'm all there for it. And this is a great example of that. You know, there's no point duplicating work, duplicating resources, especially with kind of how slammed everyone is in our industry. And finally, we've got to get our head around this idea that there is kind of mutual kind of positive sum gain. It's not the fact that if we help cyber risk, that it will make cyber risk look good and the threat intelligence team will comparatively look worse. We need to get away from that mindset and understand that if we can contribute to cyber risk, if we can kind of help actually build that out and improve the relevance of those assessments, then it's going to give the threat intelligence team a great profile with an organization as a whole. So how do we do this? Well, we've put out a white paper we're going to talk about at the end, but really it's a three-step process. And the good news is a lot of this is actually reasonably kind of straightforward, even though there are challenges in each step. The first thing comes down to building mutual understanding. We have to acknowledge that these are different disciplines with specialist knowledge. We don't necessarily need to become, if we're in threat intelligence, we don't necessarily need to become masters in cyber risk, but we need to at least understand the kind of the broad process, the broad workflows, how it's kind of approached within an organization, the sort of frameworks being used. Vice versa, we also see that a lot of cyber risk professionals don't really understand threat intelligence. Or worse, they might actually have misperceptions of threat intelligence. They might think it's just about indicators. So having that education, building those relationships and building mutual understanding without necessarily putting expectations that we have to become experts in this other discipline, that's really important. And once we've done that, the good news is actually a lot of the foundations of a threat intelligence program are things that we can directly apply to cyber risk as a stakeholder. So thinking about how we understand the use cases, the intelligence requirements of cyber risk, a lot of that is very much intelligence 101, but it's applied to cyber risk in a very intentional way. So that should actually be something that we're well equipped to do if we've got those foundation elements in place. And if we don't have those foundation elements in place within a threat intelligence team, then we've probably got a more underlying issue that we need to address. And then third, if we can kind of do that, if we can build that mutual understanding, start applying the foundational aspects of a threat intelligence program to cyber risk, then we're in a really exciting place where we can actually start to collaborate directly, kind of through iterative exercises with a cyber risk team. It's often then when this really comes alive. So I won't go through the kind of building mutual understanding in too much depth. I think it's suffice to say that there are some kind of unique lexicons to each side of the disciplines. And we probably get hung up on the things that we're not doing in threat intelligence that cyber risk is. We think, oh, we're not an auditing part of the organization, or cyber risk thinks, we don't do hunt missions. This isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to collaborate. So what we really want to focus on is that lovely kind of piece in the middle where there's a lot of these areas that we're both mutually interested in. And this can be a great way to actually frame a discussion, throw this on a kind of slide deck and start talking with your kind of cyber risk team. Hey, there's a lot in the middle that we're both mutually interested in. How do we collaborate on this? Now, I think at this point, it's kind of, how do we kind of start operationalizing this? How do we actually move this forwards? And there's often an expectation that there's some kind of secret source that we can provide that's going to kind of really help. This is kind of secret framework that was yet to be kind of discovered that's going to kind of unlock this integration. But we need to move past that secret source and go back to CTI fundamentals. And I hope most people in this room are kind of old enough to appreciate the kind of retro word art references here. And if you're too young, then probably not interested in speaking to you anyway. But things like stakeholder analysis. Can we actually understand what these cyber risk professionals are doing? What are their use cases? What are the things that make their lives kind of really difficult? How can threat intelligence play a role? Starting to actually build threat intelligence requirements. Again, I don't need to belabor this point. I assume that most of you are familiar with this. There are other talks going into this in a lot more depth. But there's a huge amount of opportunity there. And critically, we need to embrace that kind of role as a service provider within threat intelligence. Right, it's easy for us as threat intelligence to think of all the really kind of fascinating things that we're working on. We've done a really cool report on Russia, Ukraine. We're kind of looking into Israel right now. We're kind of doing all this great stuff. We kind of often will build reports based on what we think are interesting, rather than really taking that service provider approach where we think, what is it that our stakeholders need? What are their challenges? Let's build reports with them front and center and really kind of tailor our reports to them. So embracing that kind of service provider mentality, that's really important. And actually for me, it's a really exciting space to be in. Because yes, this is a threat intelligence conference. This is a safe space for us all to complain about cyber risk professionals. But at the same time, that's kind of a bad mindset, right? If the problem is it's just cyber risk professionals not understanding anything around CTI, then we're completely unempowered to actually do something about it. If we focus on the ways that we can kind of apply these CTI foundational concepts, then all of a sudden we have a huge amount of agency to build those collaborative workflows ourselves. So I just want to finish my section by thinking about kind of some more kind of specific ideas on how we would do that. First of all, we want to embrace that role as an educator. We are going to be working with stakeholders that might not understand threat intelligence. They might have misperceptions. They might think it's just fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or it's just too tactical. We need to kind of embrace that might be the starting point. We need to educate. We need to kind of help explain. We might want to bring a menu of different kind of ideas of things that might work. It's going to take a bit of time, and we want to embrace the fact that these people might not have the full understanding of threat intelligence, and that's fine. We also want to start simple. We can get really kind of bogged down in some kind of cyber risk framework that we don't fully understand. But actually, if we kind of start simple with one intelligence requirement, we can iterate from there. We can build that over time. And over time, we'll start to organically get much more understanding of cyber risk. So we don't necessarily need to do it all at once. We can start simple and iterate. Focusing on what you can control and manage, I've already covered. And ultimately, don't be afraid to push back. So what I mean by that is we want to be that service provider. We want to provide the kind of insight that people are asking us for. But we also are the experts in threat intelligence. We're working with often immature stakeholders. So we shouldn't be afraid to actually offer suggestions, maybe slightly suggest a kind of a slight tweaking to an intelligence request to make sure it's something that we can kind of really deliver. But so far, I've really very much talked about, well, how can we apply all these foundational concepts? What can we do within the threat intelligence team? But for me, this gets really exciting in the next step when we start to actually collaborate actively with the cyber risk professionals. So I'm going to hand over to John to cover this very exciting topic.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate that. So where I'd like to start these discussions off in most cases is with a foundational formula. So there are 3 functions to help us prioritize risk, if you think about it. You can kind of denote these as threat as these 3 functions: intent, capability, and opportunity, of which organizations only control one of those. So once you start to narrow down the scope and understand what we mean by opportunity, we then can actually unpack and have a more educated discussion, have a more collaborative discussion with our peers. In this particular case, what we are referencing here is exposed attack surface. What we are explaining here is exposed attack surface, or the space in which adversaries can take advantage of, not just vulnerabilities, although risk will typically just kind of gravitate towards that. We can't influence the way nation-state actors or criminal actors want to target different sectors or different industries or different individuals. So understanding where we are and what we can control in the equation becomes very useful, of which, as Jamie pointed out earlier, we have some context, usually on the intelligence side. We're very good at understanding the actor sets. We're very good at understanding the capabilities. We're very good at supporting intrusion analysis and incident response engagements. We understand what the motivation is in most cases. However, when it comes to that actionability, when it comes to providing those mitigations, those hardening suggestions, we tend not to really fulsomely understand what's in our environment. And this is an opportunity for us to collaborate with risk, who has access to other sources that we don't. The risk register, sometimes the asset management system, the CMDB, so on and so forth. We can leverage our knowledge, our understanding of our processes, and try and find parity between what risk has. So the slide you see up here, you've got the typical intelligence life cycle drawn out. All of you, I expect, are familiar with that. But what you might not be familiar with is risk management takes a very similar approach. Theirs is a little different, though. So whereas we are an input to several of their different phases here, we can also be an output. So there is a symbiotic relationship that exists between the two to help with understanding and identifying what the actual risks are vis-a-vis the threats that cyber actors pose. We can help them understand what the impact comes out to also. We can help with monitoring adjustment. And one of the best use cases, one of the best outcomes from collaborative engagement with a risk management team is they come back to you. You become a trusted advisor. Hey, should we put this policy into place? Should we think about putting this control? Will it have the effect that we're thinking about? That's huge. That's the gravitas that Jamie was just referring to about how you actually win agency with them. Now, in our field, we are very steeped. We look at things in terms of frameworks and mental models. Go to find out, that's not dissimilar to other disciplines also. As we start to peel back the layers, we can see that there's connective tissue that actually joins both our discipline as well as risk management. So some of the frameworks and the mental models Natalie called out in her presentation, diamond model there, MITRE ATT&CK, we can look at the kill chains. Where we flip over to the risk management side, it's very well documented, much like our field, and some of these mental models are very well documented too. There's a nice intersection though. This is where our cybersecurity peers have come together, understood risk, and tried to find a meet in the middle solution to help with qualifying, to help with quantifying, to help with prioritization of different risks. The one that I really like to call out the most is the OOP risk methodology here, where they actually take practical, hands-on, tangible, more tactical TTPs that adversaries are using and come up with a quantification. So now we can speak the same language. Now we can have a framework that talks about things in a common shared vernacular. So we have that set of reference, so we have that understanding that is distributed between both parties. One of the things that we called out yesterday, and Grace did a wonderful job pulling this together for us as part of our workshop, is there are different integration points. What do these look like? As risk is doing their formulation, as they're trying to identify threats and vulnerabilities in the actual environment itself, as we are trying to pull together strategic products to help with a broad set of understandings for risk management, for leadership, there's different interjection points. So we may finish creating a threat profile for organization. We may finish creating a profile for APT 29 or some named group. That can then feed into a risk assessment. So now they have a backstopping, they have better understanding, they can more fulsomely actually assess the impact to the organization and what controls need to be taken into account. Whether there needs to be a new technology in place or a process or a deficiency or integration with the security awareness team, so on and so forth. We start to think now about building those workflows, the enumeration of what collaboration actually looks like in practice. We've kind of outlined here just a few different areas where we can conceive, and this is just designed to be representative, not fulsome and inclusive, but kind of that threat profile is the first foundational element, identifying what the crown jewels are. So as part of our workshop yesterday, we talked a lot about your IT security team and your IT administrators probably have a good idea of what they think the crown jewels are. Let me ask you, do you think that aligns with what the adversaries think the crown jewels are, what they'd be going after? No, probably not. So this is a point in which we can actually integrate together and have a more robust discussion and documentation as to what we need to prioritize our safeguards against in the organization. The threat profile is something that we've called out, and you'll see a few presentations on this throughout the conference itself. Sometimes this is called the threat landscape when we're thinking about it at a strategic level. Now, when I call out threat profile specifically, what I'm calling out is, do we understand the internal dynamics, the environment, the risk exposure? Do we understand what the threat actors are going after? Can we help actually align the two together? So what you can see here in this Venn diagram is a combination of that knowledge of the internal structure as well as knowledge of the external environment to really get us towards prioritization. And we can use this type of a methodology, this approach, as we go through and start those conversations. After we enumerate, or one tool that is useful in enumeration is a RACI matrix. Now, for some of you who have actually done project management before, this might look familiar. If you're much like me on the practitioner side, this was uncommon, this was unfamiliar until maybe a few years ago. So a RACI matrix is just a combination of different inputs. So understanding who's responsible for projects, who do we need to talk to, who needs to be informed about them, who's the constituent. Sounds very much like stakeholder analysis, identifying product lines and service deliveries and what the vehicles are. Again, things that are all kind of common knowledge to us in this field. It's just presented in a slightly different fashion. Inside of our white paper, we identified 3 different case studies. I will just briefly glimpse over this one and point you to the white paper for the other 2. So one of the ones we identified is how you can work together with risk management to come up with a risk rating for vulnerabilities. So instead of just looking at CVSS, score 9.8 and taking that as truth for like, we need to prioritize this patch now, we can actually apply some more critique to it. We can add contextualization. We can start to distill down elements that make it relevant to us to ultimately come up with a risk rating score. The other case study we call out too is on ransomware and insurance and how you can use that as a mechanism to potentially transfer risk and exploring those possibilities. Where we go here with the supply chain one is looking at something that's kind of current, something that's become more in focus in the news, more in focus with security researchers in the past 2 or 3 years. Looking at this from the software supply chain vector instead of the hardware attack vector. And what you can see is, at a high level, executive audiences may or may not understand this. And we act as an input, so we can help enumerate the different threat actors, what the capabilities are, what the different access vectors are, based on what we've seen and what we can conceptualize. As practitioners in this field, we have technical depth. That technical depth allows us to enumerate and start to hypothesize the realm of possible for adversary operations. That's very impactful. That's something that our risk colleagues can't do. So they're really relying on us or making an assumption that they've got it properly captured. If you take something like this, then we could start having meaningful conversations about what controls are in place. Do we have permissions restricted for admin build systems? Do we have software bill of materials in place and other things? This is a way in which we can actually take our education, our understanding, which is a natural augmentation and growth for our knowledge base, and help put it towards a more meaningful, practical outcome. So as we start to conclude the presentation, I just want to call out a few things. And Jamie, feel free to chime in at any point too. First and foremost, while these are 2 different disparate fields, we actually have a shared goal. That shared goal is risk reduction for the organization, better posturing of cyber defense, to make it harder for adversaries to get in, to find them quicker, et cetera, et cetera. While they're 2 siloed fields, in most cases, they shouldn't be. What we've hopefully presented you throughout the last 20 or 30 minutes is this meaningful shared common understanding, a framework in which you can take to your risk management team and start a conversation. So you can build those mutual goals, that mutual understanding and shared kind of path forward, as we call it. Now, we call out the white paper here specifically. It's, I think, 20 pages. Feel free to give a read of that. But the real bread and butter, Jamie, can you believe that we tricked them into coming to a soft skills presentation? Yep. I'm kidding, of course. Is a lot of this is people-driven. So there's relationships that go into this. So as we start thinking about how we can align, you cannot remove that human dynamic. And humans have values, intrinsic and professional. Businesses have values too, KPIs and metrics they have to align to. If we can start to understand what the business drivers are, what the personal drivers are, we can start to feed into that cycle and position ourselves to be more successful in those conversations as they manifest. Everybody loves getting credit, so bringing along peers, highlighting their shared interest, their shared contribution to leadership goes a very long way. And it's meaningful for us too. If I ask myself the what's in it for me, it's you can now start to make some shared justifications for budget, for headcount, because you're showing efficiencies, you're showing integration and organizational reach beyond what you could achieve by yourself. And as we start to conclude, we do have one ask for you. So Grace puts together this fantastic survey asking professionals in this field in CTI, how are you using information? How are you sharing information with your stakeholders? Sorry if I botched that, Grace. Can you please take 5 minutes to maybe go to this link? Jimmy, you're in the way. You're so tall. And just take this. It would be very meaningful and helpful for Grace. And with that, we want to thank her. Even though she's not up here presenting with us right now, she was an integral part of putting our workshop together yesterday and also a part of the team here. So thank you very much for your time. We'll be around at the break if you have any questions. If not, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Any questions? Okay, then with that, thank you very much for your great presentation. And now we have coffee break until 10:45.